The evening air was cool and calm as the large black van from the catering company slowly rolled through the tall iron gates of a massive private estate. Inside the van, several workers sat quietly in their uniforms, holding trays and supplies for the night's event. Among them sat a young man who kept mostly to himself. He wore the same neat black uniform as the others, but there was something thoughtful and calm about him. While the other workers talked casually or checked their phones, he simply looked out the window as the van moved along the long stone driveway. Bright lights shined across the enormous mansion ahead. The building looked more like a palace than a house. Tall glass windows reflected the golden glow of chandeliers inside, and expensive cars were already parked along the driveway. Tonight was not an ordinary event. It was a private celebration hosted by one of the most successful business leaders in the city. The young man had worked for the catering company for almost a year now. The job was not glamorous, but it helped him pay his bills and take care of the small apartment he rented across town. Most nights he worked weddings, business dinners, or large private parties like this one. He had learned to move quietly through crowded rooms, serve guests politely, and stay out of the spotlight. But tonight, something felt different. As the van stopped near the service entrance, the workers stepped out one by one. The night air carried the soft sound of music coming from inside the mansion. Laughter and conversation floated through the open doors as guests arrived for the party. Inside the service hallway, the event manager quickly gathered the team for instructions. "Listen everyone," the manager said in a calm but firm voice. "This is a high-profile event. Important people are attending tonight. Stay professional, move quickly, and be respectful. If a guest asks for something, help them right away." Everyone nodded and began preparing their trays. The young man adjusted the sleeves of his uniform and picked up a silver tray filled with glasses. He had done this many times before, yet something about the grand house made him feel slightly nervous. As he stepped into the main hall, he immediately noticed how beautiful everything looked. The ceiling was high and decorated with elegant lights that sparkled like stars. Large paintings hung along the walls, and tall flower arrangements stood on polished marble tables. Guests in expensive suits and elegant dresses filled the room. Their conversations were confident and relaxed, the kind of voices that belonged to people who lived in a world very different from his. He quietly moved through the crowd, offering drinks with a polite smile. Most guests barely noticed him, which was normal. Waiters were meant to blend into the background. Still, he observed everything carefully. It was a habit he had developed over time. Then something in the center of the room caught his attention. Not far from the large staircase stood a beautiful grand piano. It was black and glossy, reflecting the golden lights above it. The piano looked elegant and powerful, almost like it was waiting for someone to sit down and bring it to life. For a moment he slowed his steps. He tried to focus on his work, but his eyes kept drifting back to the piano. Something about it pulled his attention in a quiet but powerful way. Memories began to rise in his mind. Many years earlier, long before he started working at events like this, music had been a very important part of his life. When he was a small child, his mother had owned a very old piano in their tiny living room. The piano was not perfect. Some keys were worn, and a few notes sounded slightly different from the others. But to him, it was the most beautiful instrument in the world. His mother loved music deeply. She believed that music had the power to calm the heart and bring people together. When he was young, she would sit beside him and guide his small hands across the keys. At first, he played simple melodies. His fingers were clumsy and slow, but she always encouraged him. "Don't rush," she used to say with a warm smile. "Music is not about being fast. It's about feeling every note." Those quiet evenings beside the piano had been some of the happiest moments of his childhood. But life had not always been easy. As the years passed, many responsibilities filled his days. School, work, and daily struggles slowly pushed music further into the background. The piano in their old apartment eventually became silent. Yet the love for music never truly disappeared. Even now, whenever he saw a piano, something inside him felt awake again. Standing in the grand hall of the mansion, he looked at the instrument again while carefully holding his tray. It was much larger and more beautiful than the piano he had known as a child. The polished surface reflected the sparkling lights above it, and the keys looked perfectly smooth. A soft instrumental playlist was already playing through hidden speakers in the room, but the piano itself remained untouched. He wondered if anyone would play it tonight. As guests continued arriving, the room grew more crowded. Laughter echoed through the hall as business partners greeted each other and friends shared stories. A group of musicians had been hired to perform later in the evening, but they had not arrived yet. For now, the piano simply stood quietly in the center of the room like a silent guest. The young waiter continued moving through the crowd, offering drinks and collecting empty glasses. Every now and then, he glanced toward the piano again. He imagined how the keys would feel beneath his fingers after so many years. Would he still remember the songs his mother taught him? Would the music still come naturally? The thought made him smile slightly, but he quickly returned to his work. This was not his place. He reminded himself that he was here as a worker, not a performer. Still, something about the evening felt strangely meaningful, though he could not explain why. At one point, he stepped near the edge of the main hall to refill his tray. From that angle, he had a clear view of the piano. Several guests stood nearby, chatting casually beside it. None of them seemed interested in playing. He wondered if they even noticed the instrument at all. To many people in the room, the piano was probably just another decoration. Another beautiful object placed there to make the party look elegant. But to him, it was much more than that. It represented memories, emotions, and a connection to someone he deeply missed. For a moment, he stood still, watching it quietly. Then one of the guests approached him and took a glass from his tray, pulling him back into his duties. "Thank you," the guest said before returning to the conversation. The waiter nodded politely and continued walking through the hall. The night was only beginning, and there were many hours of work ahead. Yet somewhere deep inside him, a quiet feeling continued to grow. He had no idea that before the night ended, that silent piano in the center of the room would change everything. The evening continued to grow livelier as more guests arrived at the mansion. The soft music playing through the speakers blended with the sound of cheerful conversations and quiet laughter. Crystal glasses clinked together as people greeted each other warmly. The entire hall felt full of energy and excitement. The young waiter moved carefully between the groups of guests, holding his silver tray with steady hands. He had learned to walk smoothly without drawing attention to himself. Most people hardly noticed him, which was normal for someone doing his job. His task was simple: serve drinks, clear empty glasses, and make sure the guests were comfortable. Still, his eyes occasionally wandered back to the grand piano standing near the center of the room. From where he walked, he could see the reflection of the lights shining on its smooth black surface. The piano looked almost alive in the glow of the chandeliers. Even though the room was filled with people, the instrument seemed strangely quiet and patient, as if it were waiting for something. As he passed by it again, he slowed down for just a second. He did not touch it. He would never do that while working. But the memory of those old evenings with his mother came back again. He remembered how she used to sit beside him, gently guiding his fingers across the keys. Sometimes she would laugh when he made mistakes, but she never sounded disappointed. She always believed that music was something joyful, not something to fear. Those memories felt warm, but they also carried a little sadness. He shook the thoughts away and continued serving guests. Near the piano, a small group of people had gathered. They looked confident and relaxed, dressed in expensive suits and elegant dresses. Their voices were louder than most of the other conversations in the room. They seemed to enjoy being the center of attention. One of them noticed the waiter walking past with the tray. "Hey, over here," the man said casually. The waiter stepped closer and politely held out the tray. Two people took glasses while continuing their conversation. As he turned to leave, one of the women in the group glanced toward the piano and then back at him. "You were looking at that earlier," she said with a playful tone. The waiter paused slightly, unsure how to respond. "I noticed," she continued with a small smile. "Do you play?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment, he simply stood there holding the tray. Before he could answer, one of the men in the group chuckled. "Oh, come on," he said jokingly. "You think the waiter plays piano?" The others laughed lightly. It was not loud or cruel laughter, but it carried a tone that made the waiter feel uncomfortable. He quickly tried to keep the situation polite. "I just like music," he said quietly. Another man leaned slightly closer to the piano and looked at it with exaggerated curiosity. "Well, if you like music, you should play something for us," he said jokingly. The group laughed again. The waiter felt the warmth rising to his face. He did not like being the focus of attention, especially in a room full of strangers. "I'm just working tonight," he replied calmly. But the teasing did not stop. "Come on," the woman said with a playful grin. "It's just a piano. Give us a little concert." The others laughed again, clearly enjoying the moment. The waiter forced a small polite smile and gently stepped away. "I should get back to serving," he said. He walked toward another group of guests, hoping the moment would simply pass. But the people near the piano continued talking about it. Their voices carried across the room. "Imagine if he actually tried to play," one of them joked. Another responded with a laugh. "That would be the entertainment of the night." The waiter pretended not to hear them, but their words stayed in his mind. He focused on his work, moving from table to table and offering drinks to guests. Still, the piano remained in the corner of his vision. A little while later, he returned to the service hallway to refill his tray. Other staff members were moving quickly, preparing more food and drinks for the growing crowd. "Busy night," one of the servers said as he passed by. The young waiter nodded. "Yes," he replied quietly. When his tray was ready again, he stepped back into the main hall. The party had grown even louder. More guests had arrived, and the conversations were becoming more energetic. Near the piano, the same group of guests was still gathered. As he approached their area again, one of the men spotted him. "Hey, the music lover is back," the man said loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. The waiter felt the attention turning toward him again. He kept his posture calm and offered the tray. But instead of taking a drink right away, the man pointed toward the piano. "So tell us," he said with a grin, "do you actually play? Or were you just admiring the furniture?" A few more people nearby started listening. The waiter hesitated. He could feel the eyes of several strangers watching him now. For a moment, he thought about simply saying no and walking away. But something inside him stopped him. He remembered his mother's voice again, encouraging him years ago. Music was never something to be ashamed of. Still, he did not want to become a joke for the entire room. "I learned a little when I was younger," he said carefully. That answer only made the group more amused. "Oh really?" one of the women said. "So we do have a musician here tonight." Another guest laughed. "This party just got interesting." The waiter shifted his weight slightly, still holding the tray. "I haven't played in a long time," he added quietly. The man closest to the piano leaned against it casually. "Well, tonight might be your lucky night," he said with a grin. He tapped the top of the piano lightly with his fingers. "Go on. Play something." The group laughed again. The waiter felt his heart beating faster. This was not the kind of attention he wanted. He looked around the room quickly, hoping someone would change the subject or call him away for work. But several nearby guests were now watching with curiosity. To them, it probably looked like harmless fun. But to him, it felt much more personal. He took a slow breath and tried to remain calm. "I really should keep working," he said politely. But the teasing continued. One of the guests clapped his hands lightly. "Come on, just a few notes," he said. "It will make the party more fun." The laughter grew again, spreading to a few more people nearby. The waiter stood there quietly, unsure what to do next. He looked at the piano once more. The glossy surface reflected the bright lights above, and the keys looked smooth and perfect. Part of him wanted to walk away immediately. Another part of him felt something deeper stirring inside. The memory of his mother's warm smile returned again. For years, he had kept his music to himself. Now, standing in the middle of a room full of strangers, the instrument that once meant so much to him was only a few steps away. The voices around him continued joking and laughing, waiting to see what he would do. And slowly, without realizing it, the moment was beginning to grow into something much bigger than anyone expected. The laughter around the piano slowly faded into quiet curiosity as more people noticed what was happening. At first, it had just been a small group joking with the waiter, but now a few nearby guests had turned their heads to watch. Some were smiling, others looked mildly interested, and a few simply seemed curious about how the situation would end. The young waiter still held the silver tray in his hands. The glasses on it clinked softly as he shifted his grip. He could feel the attention in the room, and it made his chest feel tight. He had faced difficult moments before in life, but this felt different. It was not anger or shouting that made him uncomfortable. It was the light teasing and the quiet expectation in the air. To many of the guests, it probably felt like harmless entertainment. But to him, it felt like standing on a stage he never planned to step onto. One of the men near the piano leaned forward again with a playful smile. "So," he said casually, "you said you learned a little when you were younger. That sounds like enough to give us a short performance." A few people chuckled again. Another guest lifted a drink and added jokingly, "Yes, let's hear it. The party could use a surprise." The waiter glanced toward the service hallway. For a moment he thought about simply walking away. If he returned to the kitchen area, the moment would probably fade and everyone would move on to something else. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the piano itself. Maybe it was the memories that kept returning to his mind. Or maybe it was the quiet feeling that he had been avoiding music for too long. He looked down at the tray in his hands. Then he gently set it on a nearby table. The small action caught the attention of several people around him. "Look at that," someone said quietly. "He's thinking about it." The young waiter took a slow breath. "I haven't played in many years," he said honestly. His voice was calm but careful. The man standing near the piano shrugged lightly. "That's okay," he replied with a smile. "We're not expecting a concert." More laughter followed, though it was softer now. The waiter looked again at the piano. The instrument seemed even more beautiful up close. The black surface was polished perfectly, and the white keys reflected the light like small pieces of ivory. For a moment, he remembered the old piano from his childhood home again. That piano had scratches on its surface. Some of the keys had small marks where years of playing had worn them down. But to him, it had always been perfect. He remembered sitting beside his mother during quiet evenings while she guided his hands. Sometimes they played simple songs together. Sometimes she let him try on his own while she listened patiently. Whenever he finished, she would smile proudly, even if the music was not perfect. Those memories filled his mind now like distant echoes. He slowly stepped closer to the grand piano. The room around him began to grow quieter. More guests had started paying attention. Some people leaned slightly to get a better view. Others paused their conversations and turned toward the center of the hall. Even a few of the other catering staff glanced over from across the room. The young waiter reached the piano bench. For a moment he simply stood there. He felt the weight of many eyes watching him. His heart beat a little faster. He wondered if he was making a mistake. One part of his mind told him that this moment could easily become embarrassing. If his hands trembled or if he forgot the music, the guests might laugh even more than before. But another part of him remembered something important. Music had never been about impressing people. It had always been about feeling something real. He gently sat down on the piano bench. The room grew noticeably quieter. The man who had been joking earlier folded his arms with a curious grin. "Well, this should be interesting," he whispered to the others. A few guests nearby leaned against the tables, watching with relaxed amusement. The waiter placed his hands lightly on his knees. For a few seconds he did nothing. He simply looked at the piano keys. They looked so smooth and untouched that it almost felt wrong to disturb them. He slowly lifted his hands. Then he paused again. A thought crossed his mind. It had been so many years since he last played for anyone. The last time had been in a small room with his mother sitting beside him. He could still remember her gentle voice. "Take your time," she used to say. Music is not about rushing. The memory made him smile slightly. He placed his fingers softly on the keys. They felt cool and familiar at the same time. The room waited. Some guests leaned forward with curiosity. Others simply watched with mild amusement, expecting a few awkward notes before the moment ended. The waiter closed his eyes for a brief second. He took a slow breath. Then he pressed the first key. A soft note floated through the air. The sound was clear and beautiful. A few people exchanged quick glances. They had expected hesitation, maybe even a mistake. Instead, the note sounded calm and confident. He pressed another key, then another. The melody began slowly, almost like someone gently testing the sound of the piano. For the first few seconds, a few quiet whispers still moved through the crowd. But something about the way his fingers moved across the keys started to change the mood in the room. His hands were not clumsy. They were steady. The notes began connecting together, forming a gentle melody that felt smooth and natural. The young waiter no longer seemed nervous. His shoulders relaxed slightly as the music continued. He was no longer thinking about the crowd around him. He was thinking about the music. The melody reminded him of those evenings long ago. Each note felt like a step back into those memories. The room slowly became quieter. One guest lowered his glass halfway to the table without realizing it. Another guest turned fully toward the piano, now watching with real interest instead of amusement. The small group that had been teasing him earlier stopped laughing. Their smiles slowly faded into something more thoughtful. The music continued flowing. The simple melody grew richer and deeper. The waiter's fingers moved smoothly across the keys, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Across the room, more conversations began to fade. The sound of the piano was slowly filling the hall, and without anyone saying a word, the entire atmosphere of the party was beginning to change. The music continued to flow through the large hall, and something in the atmosphere began to shift. At first, people had only paused out of curiosity. They expected a few simple notes from a nervous waiter, and then the moment would pass like a small joke during the party. But as the melody continued, that expectation slowly disappeared. The young man sitting at the piano was no longer aware of the people around him. His attention rested only on the music. His fingers moved smoothly across the keys, finding each note with quiet confidence. Felt natural, almost like he had never stopped playing. The melody grew fuller, richer, and more emotional. Guests who had been chatting only moments ago slowly turned their bodies toward the piano. One conversation ended, then another. Glasses were gently set down on tables as people listened more carefully. Near the piano, the group that had been teasing him earlier was now completely silent. One of the men who had been laughing leaned slightly forward, his expression slowly changing from amusement to surprise. He had expected something awkward, something simple that would make the group laugh again. Instead, the music sounded beautiful. Across the room, several guests moved closer without even realizing it. They were drawn by the sound the way people are naturally drawn to something meaningful. The young man's shoulders relaxed as he played. The nervous tension that had been in his body earlier had disappeared. His hands seemed to remember everything, even after so many years. The piano responded to every movement of his fingers. Each note carried through the tall ceilings and echoed softly against the elegant walls. The melody he played was not loud or dramatic. It was gentle, thoughtful, and filled with emotion. It felt like a story being told without words. A woman standing near one of the tall windows slowly folded her arms as she listened. Her earlier conversation had completely stopped. She was simply watching the pianist now. Another guest whispered quietly to the person beside him. "Where did he learn to play like that?" The other guest shrugged slightly, still focused on the music. "I have no idea," he replied softly. The sound of the piano continued to grow more expressive. The melody rose and fell like waves, sometimes soft and peaceful, sometimes deeper and stronger. Every note carried a feeling that reached the listeners in the room. The young man's face remained calm as he played. His eyes were partly lowered toward the keys, and his movements were steady and confident. He was no longer thinking about the teasing or the laughter from earlier. In his mind, the room had disappeared. Instead, he felt as if he were sitting in that small living room from many years ago, with his mother beside him. He could almost hear her gentle voice encouraging him again. "Let the music breathe," she used to say. "Feel the story inside the song." He remembered how patient she had always been. Whenever he made mistakes while learning, she never sounded frustrated. She simply asked him to try again. Those memories filled his mind as he continued playing. Each note carried a small piece of those memories. The guests in the hall felt it, even if they did not understand why. The music was honest. That honesty made it powerful. Near the back of the room, one of the catering staff members paused while carrying a tray. He looked toward the piano with wide eyes, clearly surprised by what he was hearing. Another server whispered quietly, "Is that the same guy who was serving drinks earlier?" The first one nodded slowly. "Yeah," he replied. They both stood still for a moment, listening. The entire mood of the party had changed. What had started as a playful challenge had turned into something much more meaningful. Even the soft background music that had been playing earlier had been completely forgotten. No one seemed to notice that the speakers were silent now. The piano had become the only sound in the room. The melody reached a deeper section, where the notes became more powerful and emotional. The young man's fingers moved faster now, but still with perfect control. The music filled every corner of the hall. Guests who had been standing near the doors slowly stepped closer. A few people even moved to stand along the staircase, watching from above. The man who had first suggested that the waiter should play looked around the room quietly. The earlier grin on his face had disappeared. He looked slightly embarrassed now, though he tried not to show it. Another guest beside him spoke quietly. "I didn't expect that," he admitted. "No one did," someone else replied. At the front of the room, near the large entrance doors, a tall man had just stepped inside the hall. He had been greeting some late arrivals outside and had missed the beginning of the music. As soon as he heard the piano, he stopped walking. His eyes moved across the room until they found the source of the sound. It took him a moment to realize who was sitting at the piano. The young waiter. The man watched quietly for several seconds. He did not interrupt or speak. He simply listened. The music continued building toward its final section. The young man's hands moved gracefully across the keys, blending the melody with deeper harmonies that made the piano sound almost like an orchestra. Several guests felt a small chill run through them as they listened. The emotion in the music was clear. It was not about showing off skill or trying to impress anyone. It felt personal, real, honest. One woman standing near the piano quietly wiped the corner of her eye. She wasn't even sure why the music affected her so strongly. Simply did. The young man played the final part of the melody with slow, careful notes. The pace softened again, returning to the gentle tone that had begun the piece. Each note lingered in the air a little longer. The room remained completely silent. No one spoke. No glasses clinked. Even the sound of footsteps had disappeared. The final notes approached. The young man pressed the last few keys with calm precision. The final note echoed softly through the hall. Then the music stopped. For a moment no one moved. The silence that followed felt almost as powerful as the music itself. The young man slowly lifted his hands from the piano keys. He took a quiet breath and looked down for a moment, as if letting the music settle in his own mind. Around him, the room remained completely still. Dozens of guests were standing there, looking at him with expressions that were very different from the ones they had earlier in the evening. The teasing and laughter had vanished. In its place was something else. Respect, surprise, and genuine admiration. But for several long seconds, no one said a word. For a few long seconds after the final note faded away, the entire hall remained completely silent. The young man still sat on the piano bench, his hands resting gently in his lap. His breathing was calm, but inside he could feel his heart beating faster. Playing again after so many years had brought back a flood of emotions he had not expected. He slowly looked up. All around him, the guests stood quietly watching him. Just minutes earlier, The same people had been laughing and joking. The piano had seemed like nothing more than a decoration, and he had simply been another waiter walking through the room with a tray of drinks. But now the mood had changed completely. The silence was not uncomfortable anymore. Felt respectful, almost thoughtful. One guest near the staircase softly cleared his throat, as if he were the first to remember how to move again. Another person shifted slightly where they stood. A woman near the window slowly lowered her glass onto the table beside her. Then suddenly, a pair of hands began to clap. The sound was clear in the quiet room. A man standing near the center of the hall had started applauding. His expression showed genuine admiration. A moment later, another person joined him. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room filled with applause. The sound grew louder and stronger as more guests began clapping. Some even smiled as they looked toward the young man at the piano. He felt his face warm slightly from the attention. He was not used to being the focus of a room full of people, especially not people like this. But the applause did not feel mocking or playful anymore. Felt sincere. The young man slowly stood up from the piano bench. He gave a small polite nod, unsure of what else to do. The applause continued for several more seconds before gradually fading. A few guests exchanged impressed glances with each other. Near the piano, the group that had been teasing him earlier looked noticeably quieter now. One of the men rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Well," he said softly, almost to himself, "that was unexpected." Another guest beside him nodded slowly. "I think we all underestimated him," she admitted. The young man stepped slightly away from the piano, planning to return to his work before drawing any more attention. But before he could leave, someone began walking toward him through the crowd. The tall man who had entered the room near the end of the performance was now approaching the piano. Several guests quickly recognized him. He was the host of the evening, the business leader who owned the mansion and organized the party. Conversations that had slowly begun to return suddenly quieted again as people watched him walk forward. The young waiter straightened slightly, unsure of what to expect. The host stopped a few steps away from the piano and looked at the young man with a calm but curious expression. For a moment, he simply studied him. Then he spoke in a steady, thoughtful voice. "That was remarkable." The words were simple, but they carried real meaning. The young man lowered his eyes respectfully. "Thank you," he replied quietly. The host glanced briefly at the piano and then back at him. "How long have you been playing?" The question made the young man pause. "I learned when I was a child," he said. "My mother taught me." The host nodded slowly, clearly listening. "And you never studied professionally?" he asked. The young man shook his head gently. "No, I just practiced at home when I was younger." Several guests nearby looked surprised by that answer. The host folded his arms thoughtfully. "It doesn't sound like someone who only practiced at home," he said with a faint smile. The young man didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply remained quiet. The host then glanced toward the group that had first challenged the waiter to play. A few of them avoided eye contact, clearly aware that their earlier teasing had not aged well. But the host did not scold anyone or create an uncomfortable scene. Instead, he turned back to the young man. "Music like that should not stay hidden," he said calmly. The words seemed to surprise several guests nearby. The host continued speaking. "Tonight we invited many talented people to this event," he said. "Business leaders, artists, entrepreneurs. But sometimes talent appears where we least expect it." A few guests nodded quietly in agreement. The young man felt slightly overwhelmed by the attention. He had never imagined that simply playing the piano could create such a moment. The host extended his hand. "What is your name?" he asked kindly. The young man told him. The host repeated it once, as if making sure he would remember it. "Well," he said with a small smile, "I'm very glad you decided to sit down at that piano tonight." A few people in the crowd chuckled softly. The tension that had filled the room earlier had completely disappeared. Instead, there was now a sense of shared appreciation. One of the guests nearby spoke up. "You really moved the whole room," she said sincerely. Another guest added, "Yes, that performance was beautiful." The young man thanked them politely, still feeling a little shy about the attention. Across the hall, some of the other catering staff members were watching with wide smiles. They had seen him quietly working beside them all evening, carrying trays and clearing glasses. None of them had known about his musical talent either. One server whispered to another, "I had no idea he could play like that." The other nodded. "Neither did I," he said. Back near the piano, the host looked around the room at the guests. "Well," he said lightly, "I think tonight we all received an unexpected concert." A ripple of warm laughter moved through the crowd. Then the host turned back to the young man once more. "If you ever decide to perform publicly," he said thoughtfully, "I believe many people would be happy to listen." Those words stayed in the young man's mind. He had spent so many years keeping music quietly in his past that he had never seriously considered sharing it with others again. Now, standing in the middle of this elegant hall, surrounded by strangers who were applauding his music, the idea suddenly felt possible. The host gave him one final nod of appreciation before stepping back. Slowly, the guests began returning to their conversations. But the atmosphere in the room was different now. People spoke more softly near the piano. Many guests glanced toward the young man with new respect as he picked up his tray again and quietly returned to his work. The laughter that had once surrounded him earlier in the evening had been replaced with something much more meaningful. And although the party continued, the memory of that unexpected piano performance remained the true highlight of the night. After the applause faded and the guests slowly returned to their conversations, the party began moving again like it had before. Soft music started playing through the speakers once more. Glasses clinked gently as people talked, and waiters continued serving drinks around the hall. But something about the atmosphere had changed. The young waiter quietly picked up his tray from the table where he had placed it earlier. For a moment he stood still, looking at the piano again. Only minutes ago he had been sitting there, playing music that he had not shared with anyone in years. Now the piano stood quietly again, just like it had at the beginning of the evening. But the room around it felt different. Several guests who walked past him now looked at him with small smiles of recognition. A few even nodded politely as they took drinks from his tray. Earlier in the night, most people had barely noticed him. Now they did. One man accepted a glass and said quietly, "That was beautiful music." The young waiter gave a small grateful nod. "Thank you." He moved on, continuing his work like before, but inside he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Pride. Not the loud or boastful kind, but a quiet pride that came from knowing he had shared something meaningful. Across the room, the group that had teased him earlier seemed much calmer now. They were speaking quietly among themselves. When the waiter passed by them again, one of the men gently cleared his throat. "Hey," he said. The young waiter paused politely. The man looked slightly uncomfortable for a moment before speaking again. "I think we owe you an apology." The other people in the group nodded. "We were joking earlier," the man continued, "but we didn't realize how talented you were." The young waiter shook his head slightly. "It's all right," he replied calmly. "You didn't mean any harm." The woman who had first asked if he played piano smiled warmly. "Well, we're glad you did play," she said. "The whole room needed that music." The young waiter thanked them and continued walking through the hall. A little while later, he returned to the service area to refill his tray. Inside the hallway behind the main room, the other staff members were busy preparing more drinks and organizing trays. As soon as he stepped in, several of them looked up. One of the servers grinned widely. "So that was you at the piano?" The young waiter smiled shyly. "Yes." Another worker shook his head in amazement. "Why didn't you ever tell us you could play like that?" He shrugged slightly. "It just never came up," he said. A few of the staff members laughed kindly. "Well," one of them said, "you definitely surprised everyone tonight." The young waiter picked up another tray and returned to the main hall. The party continued for several more hours. Guests enjoyed dinner, conversations, and the company of friends and colleagues. Later in the evening, the musicians who had been hired for the event arrived and began performing near the stage area. But even as the night continued, People still talked about the unexpected piano performance. Every now and then, someone would mention it during conversation. "Did you hear that waiter play earlier?" I couldn't believe it. The whole room went silent. The young waiter heard small pieces of those conversations while moving through the crowd, but he tried not to think too much about it. He simply focused on doing his job well. Near the end of the night, the guests slowly began leaving the mansion. Cars pulled up to the entrance as drivers waited to take people home. Inside, the staff members started clearing tables and collecting empty glasses. The young waiter carefully stacked trays and carried them back to the kitchen area. He was tired, but it was the good kind of tired that comes after a long day of work. As he walked back through the hall one last time, he glanced at the piano again. The instrument stood quietly under the chandelier lights. He paused for just a moment. Earlier in the evening, it had felt like a distant memory from his childhood. Now it felt like something much closer. He wondered what his mother would have said if she had been there to see it. He imagined her smiling proudly the way she used to whenever he finished playing a song. The thought made him smile softly. "Thinking about playing again?" The voice came from behind him. He turned and saw the host of the party walking toward him. The man looked relaxed now that most of the guests had left. The young waiter straightened slightly. "I was just remembering something," he replied. The host nodded as he glanced at the piano. "You created a special moment tonight," he said. The young waiter looked a little surprised. "I was just playing," he said. The host shook his head gently. "It was more than that," he replied. "Music like that brings people together. For a few minutes tonight, the whole room stopped and listened." The young waiter didn't know what to say to that, so he simply smiled. The host continued. "Do you still practice?" he asked. "Not as much as I used to," the young man admitted. The host looked thoughtful for a moment. "You should consider playing again," he said. "Not just for yourself, but for others too." Those words stayed in the young waiter's mind. For a long time he had believed that music belonged only in his past. Life had taken him in other directions, and the piano had slowly become something he rarely thought about. But tonight had reminded him how powerful music could be. The host gave him a friendly nod. "Thank you for the performance," he said before heading toward the exit. Soon after, the remaining staff finished cleaning the hall. The lights were dimmed, and the once lively room became quiet again. Outside, the catering van waited near the service entrance. The workers climbed inside one by one, tired but satisfied after a successful event. The young waiter took a seat near the window again, just like he had earlier that evening. As the van drove slowly down the long driveway, he looked back at the mansion one last time. The tall windows glowed softly in the night. Somewhere inside that house, the piano still stood in the center of the hall. But tonight it had done more than decorate the room. It had reminded him of who he was. Sometimes people laugh or make assumptions because they only see what is on the surface. They see the uniform someone wears or the job someone is doing, and they think that tells the whole story. But the truth is, every person carries talents, memories, and experiences that others cannot see. All it takes is one moment for those hidden parts to appear. And when they do, the same crowd that once laughed can suddenly become completely silent.